In 1925, three men walked into the Amazon rainforest looking for a lost city. They carried rifles, notebooks, a few supplies, and a belief that most of the world considered ridiculous. None of them ever came back. What makes their disappearance even stranger is what happened afterward. Over the next century, dozens of people would risk their lives trying to find them. Some nearly died, others vanished themselves. And the deeper researchers looked into the mystery, the more they began to wonder whether the missing explorer at the center of it all had been right about something history had completely misunderstood. His name was Percy Fawcett. And before we reach the end of this story, you'll understand why people are still searching for him more than 100 years later. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if stories like this are your kind of history, consider subscribing. Here on Forgotten Echoes, we explore the people and mysteries that time never fully explained. The last confirmed message Percy Fawcett ever sent reached the outside world in May of 1925. It wasn't dramatic. There was no panic, no warning, no sign that anything was wrong. In fact, he sounded confident. Confident enough that nobody reading the message imagined they were looking at the final words of one of history's most famous missing explorers. What nobody knew at the time was that Percy was already moving toward a place where the map ended. And once he crossed that line, history would lose sight of him forever. But to understand why he was willing to take that risk, we have to go back several years, long before the disappearance, long before the headlines. Back to a quiet evening in England. Percy sat alone at a table covered in maps. His wife, Nina, had gone to bed hours earlier. The house was silent. Only the light of a lamp illuminated the room. Scattered across the table were sketches, reports from South America, old expedition notes, and a centuries-old document that many experts believed was nonsense. Percy disagreed. The document described a ruined city hidden somewhere deep in Brazil. Stone buildings, roads, carvings, evidence of a civilization that wasn't supposed to exist. Most scholars dismissed the account as fantasy. Percy couldn't stop thinking about it. The more he studied South America, the more he noticed something strange. Stories kept repeating. Different travelers, different regions, different decades, yet the same rumors appeared again and again. Lost ruins, ancient roads, forgotten settlements hidden beneath jungle growth. Coincidences happen, but Percy was beginning to suspect these weren't coincidences. The problem was that almost nobody agreed with him. At the time, many experts believed the Amazon had never supported large civilizations. The rainforest was considered too harsh, too unforgiving, too difficult. One academic reportedly described stories of hidden cities as little more than adventure fiction. Percy read criticisms like that often, sometimes in newspapers, sometimes in scholarly journals, sometimes directly from people he respected. But instead of discouraging him, the criticism seemed to strengthen his resolve. Because unlike many of his critics, Percy had actually spent years inside the Amazon. He had crossed rivers that didn't appear on maps. He had met indigenous communities living far beyond the reach of modern cities. He had seen things that didn't fit neatly into accepted theories. And once you've seen something with your own eyes, it's hard to convince yourself it doesn't exist. The obsession grew slowly. Then all at once, what began as professional curiosity became a mission, and eventually it became personal. By the early 1920s, Percy was no longer just exploring South America. He was searching for something. He called it simply Z, not because he knew exactly where it was, not because he knew who built it, but because he believed somewhere in the vast interior of Brazil there had once been a sophisticated civilization waiting to be rediscovered. The idea cost him more than people realized. Expeditions were expensive. Years away from home created strain, and every journey carried risks, disease, accidents, violence, getting lost, not returning at all. Yet whenever Percy came home, he eventually found himself staring at maps again, planning again, searching again. One evening, Nina found him doing exactly that. The children were asleep. Maps covered the table. Notes were piled in stacks. Percy looked exhausted, but his eyes were alive, the way they always were when he spoke about South America. Nina asked him a simple question. "Do you really think you'll find it?" For a moment he looked down at the map, then back at her and quietly answered, "I think it's there. Not I hope, not maybe. I think it's there." Years later, those words would take on a haunting significance, because Percy wasn't preparing for just another expedition. Whether he realized it or not, he was preparing for the journey that would define his life. And the decision he made next would shock almost everyone around him. Instead of assembling a large professional team, he chose to bring his son. A decision that would change everything. When Percy Fawcett announced that his son Jack would join the expedition, many people thought he had lost his mind. The Amazon was not an adventure park. It was one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Explorers disappeared there. Disease spread quickly. A simple injury could become a death sentence hundreds of miles from help. Yet Jack wasn't being forced into the journey. If anything, he was more eager than his father. At 21 years old, Jack had spent much of his life listening to stories about South America. He had grown up watching maps cover dining room tables. He had heard conversations about lost ruins and unexplored regions. For years, the Amazon had existed in his imagination. Now he wanted to see it for himself. Not everyone understood. Friends warned him. Some relatives questioned the decision. Even people who admired Percy privately wondered whether bringing a young son into such a dangerous environment was irresponsible. But Jack remained committed, and there was someone else. A close friend named Raleigh Rimmel, only 18 years old, young, energetic, and excited by the possibility of participating in something extraordinary. Together, the three men formed an unlikely team, an aging explorer chasing the dream of a lifetime, a son determined to prove himself, and a teenager stepping into one of history's greatest mysteries without realizing it. Looking back now, there is something unsettling about the photographs taken before they left. You can still see them today, standing together, smiling, confident. They look like men at the beginning of a great adventure, not people approaching the final chapter of their lives. As departure day approached, Percy became increasingly secretive. This wasn't unusual. He had spent years protecting information about his theories. He worried that rival explorers might attempt to reach the area before him. But this time, the secrecy felt different, more deliberate, more intense. Even some supporters didn't know exactly where he intended to go. That decision would later create enormous problems, because when the expedition vanished, nobody could say with certainty where to start looking. One evening before departure, Percy sat down to write letters. Some were practical, others deeply personal. The words were calm, measured, but hidden between the lines was something revealing. Percy understood the risks, far more than anyone criticizing him from afar. He had spent decades surviving situations that would terrify most people. He knew exactly how dangerous the Amazon could be. And perhaps because he understood those dangers so well, he made a request that would later puzzle the world. If his expedition disappeared, he urged people not to organize major rescue efforts. At first, that sounds strange, almost cold, but Percy wasn't being careless. He had seen what happened when people rushed into unfamiliar territory searching for missing explorers. One disaster often created another. A rescue mission could become the next tragedy. He knew that better than most. Years later, those words would feel almost prophetic, because despite his warning, people would spend decades searching for him, and some would pay a terrible price. In April 1925, the expedition finally began. The farewell itself was surprisingly ordinary. No dramatic speeches, no sense that history was about to be made. Just handshakes, goodbyes, and the familiar uncertainty that comes with any dangerous journey. For Nina, however, the moment felt different. She had watched Percy leave before, many times, but something about this expedition lingered. Perhaps it was his age. Perhaps it was the years of obsession finally reaching their conclusion. Or perhaps it was simply intuition. Whatever the reason, she later admitted that this departure stayed with her. As the train carried Percy, Jack, and Raleigh toward South America, the dream that had occupied Percy for years was finally becoming reality. Soon they reached Brazil. Then came the long journey inland. The farther they traveled, the thinner the connection to the outside world became. Cities gave way to villages. Villages gave way to rivers. And eventually, even the familiar trails began to disappear. Yet early reports from the expedition were encouraging. Messages occasionally reached friends and family. The men appeared healthy. Morale was high. The journey was difficult, but that was expected. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested disaster. Then something happened that few people noticed at the time. During the expedition's progress, Percy began sending messages that sounded increasingly optimistic. Not cautious, not uncertain, optimistic, almost as if he believed he was getting closer to something important, closer than he had ever been before. One report described his confidence as unusually high. Another suggested he believed key clues were finally beginning to align. Exactly what those clues were remains unclear. But historians have spent decades wondering whether Percy had seen something, a landmark, a pattern, information he never had time to fully explain. Because around this point, the expedition approached a location that would later become one of the most famous places in exploration history. A place with a grim name, a place Percy knew well, a place called Dead Horse Camp. And what happened after they reached it would transform an ambitious expedition into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. Dead Horse Camp was not just another stop along the route. For Percy Fawcett, it carried a memory. Years earlier, during one of his expeditions, a horse had become too exhausted to continue. There was no way to save it. Reluctantly, Percy had put the animal down and buried it there. The name remained. And now, in 1925, he had returned. No one standing at that camp could have known it would become one of the most important locations in the entire mystery. Because from this point forward, certainty begins to disappear. Everything before Dead Horse Camp is relatively clear. Everything after it becomes a puzzle. When Percy, Jack, and Raleigh arrived, they were reportedly tired but optimistic. The journey had been demanding. The tropical heat was relentless. Food had to be carefully managed. Every mile required effort. Yet the expedition was still moving according to plan. And then Percy wrote what would become his final confirmed message. Today, historians still study that letter. Not because it contains some hidden code, not because it reveals a shocking secret, but because it sounds so normal. That is what makes it unsettling. There is no fear in the message. No sign of panic, no indication that the men were in immediate danger. Instead, Percy described conditions as favorable and expressed confidence about the journey ahead. He sounded exactly like a man who expected to return. And that's what makes the letter so haunting, because we know something he didn't. He was writing from the edge of history. The letter eventually reached Nina. At the time, it likely brought comfort. Percy was alive. Jack was alive. The expedition was continuing. There was no reason to worry. But hidden inside the message was a decision that would shape everything that followed. Percy explained that they were about to move beyond the last area where reliable communication would be possible. After this point, letters would be difficult. Updates would become rare. Then eventually, there would be silence. Again, this wasn't unusual. Exploration in remote regions often involved long periods without contact. The family had experienced it before, so nobody panicked when the next letter didn't arrive, or the one after that. Weeks passed, then months, still nothing. At first, people assumed the expedition had simply encountered delays. Perhaps weather conditions had slowed them down. Perhaps transportation problems had interrupted communication. The Amazon was enormous. Unexpected setbacks were common, but as the silence continued, concern began to spread. Then came one of the strangest details in the entire story. Several individuals later claimed they had encountered Percy and his companions after Dead Horse Camp. The accounts came from different places, different people, different times, and they didn't always agree. One witness described the explorers as healthy and determined. Another recalled seeing them heading deeper into unfamiliar territory. A third account suggested Percy had become increasingly convinced that his destination was near. The problem was that none of these sightings could be fully verified. Some may have been accurate, others may have been mistaken, but together they created a disturbing possibility. What if the expedition had traveled much farther than anyone realized? What if the place where Percy vanished wasn't anywhere near where searchers would later look? As the weeks stretched into months, newspapers began paying attention. At first, coverage was limited. Percy Fawcett was well known in exploration circles, but not yet a household name. That changed quickly. The longer the silence lasted, the more interest grew. Readers became fascinated. A respected explorer, his young son, a promising friend, all gone, no explanation, no evidence, no answers. And then another question emerged, a troubling one. Why hadn't anyone come back? Think about it. If the expedition had simply encountered difficulties, why hadn't at least one member returned for help? Why hadn't anyone reached a settlement? Why hadn't any equipment been found? 3 experienced travelers don't simply vanish without leaving something behind. Yet that appeared to be exactly what had happened. The mystery was growing. And somewhere in England, Nina Fawcett was waiting. Every day without news brought fresh uncertainty. Every knock at the door carried possibility. Every letter that arrived raised hope before revealing disappointment. She had supported Percy's dream for years. Now she found herself trapped in the hardest part of exploration, not the journey, the waiting. Months turned into a year turned into more. Still no verified word from Percy, Jack, or Raleigh. And eventually, the world began accepting a painful reality. If answers were going to come, someone would have to go looking for them. What nobody realized was that the search for Percy Fawcett was about to become almost as dangerous as the expedition itself. Because the first rescue parties entering the Amazon weren't just chasing missing men. They were stepping into a mystery that would consume lives, create legends, and leave behind even more unanswered questions than the disappearance itself. The first rescue missions entered the Amazon believing they would bring Percy Fawcett home. Most of them expected answers within weeks. Perhaps a damaged camp, a trail, abandoned equipment, a witness who had seen the explorers pass through, something, anything. Instead, the jungle gave them almost nothing, and that frightened them. Because the deeper they searched, the more impossible the disappearance began to seem. One searcher later described the Amazon as a place that could erase evidence faster than people could create it. A trail visible one day could disappear after a storm. A campsite could be swallowed by vegetation within months. The forest never stopped growing, never stopped changing, never stopped reclaiming. Yet even understanding that didn't explain everything. Percy wasn't inexperienced. This wasn't a wealthy tourist wandering into danger. This was one of the most accomplished explorers of his generation. A man who had survived years in South America. A man who knew the risks. A man who had spent decades learning how to navigate environments that overwhelmed others. If someone like Percy could disappear completely, what chance did anyone else have? The first search parties quickly discovered another problem. The farther they traveled, the more conflicting information they received. One village claimed the expedition had passed through safely. Another insisted they had never been there. A third suggested they had traveled east. A fourth pointed west. Some witnesses seemed certain. Others contradicted each other entirely. Every lead created new questions. Every answer seemed to produce 2 more mysteries. Then came a report that captured public attention. A group claimed they had heard stories about 3 foreign explorers who had ventured deeper into territory rarely visited by outsiders. The account couldn't be verified, but newspapers seized on it immediately. For families desperate for hope, even rumors mattered. And hope was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Back in England, Nina continued defending her husband. Many people assumed Percy was dead. She wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. Friends urged caution. Critics questioned whether continuing the search made sense. But Nina understood something most outsiders didn't. No body had been found. No confirmed evidence had surfaced. There was still room for possibility, and as long as possibility existed, hope remained alive. Meanwhile, the mystery itself was becoming famous, not because answers were emerging, because answers weren't. The disappearance began attracting explorers from around the world. Some wanted to solve the mystery, others wanted adventure. A few hoped that finding Percy Fawcett would make their own names famous. But the Amazon had a way of humbling people. Several rescue efforts failed almost immediately. Others became lost. Some had to be rescued themselves. A few ended in tragedy. The search was creating victims of its own. Years later, estimates suggested that numerous people may have lost their lives while attempting to solve the Fawcett mystery. Think about that for a moment. One missing expedition, then years of additional danger caused by the search itself. The mystery was no longer just a disappearance. It had become a chain reaction, a century-long pursuit with no clear ending. Then investigators stumbled upon something unexpected. Not evidence of Percy, evidence that challenged history itself. While moving through remote parts of the Amazon, explorers repeatedly encountered signs that people had lived there on a much larger scale than many scholars believed possible. Some reported unusual earthworks. Others described ancient embankments. There were stories of straight roads hidden beneath vegetation, evidence of planning, evidence of engineering, evidence of something bigger. At first, many academics dismissed these observations. The prevailing belief remained unchanged. Large civilizations couldn't have existed in the Amazon. At least that was what most experts thought. But a few researchers started paying attention, because these reports sounded strangely familiar. They echoed arguments Percy Fawcett had been making for years, arguments that many people had laughed at. And that raised a fascinating possibility. What if the missing explorer had seen something others missed? What if part of his theory had been correct all along? The question changed how some people viewed the mystery. Suddenly, Percy wasn't just a missing explorer. He was a man whose ideas might deserve a second look. Yet the biggest question remained unanswered. Where was he? Then, years after the disappearance, a discovery emerged that appeared capable of ending the mystery once and for all. Human remains. If they truly belonged to Percy Fawcett, the century's greatest exploration mystery might finally have an answer. The world paid attention. Newspapers reported it. Researchers rushed to investigate. Family members followed every development. At last, it seemed possible that the story was reaching its conclusion. But the truth turned out to be far more complicated. Because the bones that many hoped belonged to Percy Fawcett would soon create an entirely new mystery. When news broke that human remains had been found in Brazil, excitement spread quickly. For the first time in years, people believed they might finally be looking at evidence instead of theories. If the bones belonged to Percy Fawcett, one of history's greatest mysteries could finally be solved. Newspapers ran headlines. Researchers examined every detail. And far away in England, the possibility of an answer stirred emotions that had been buried for decades. But mysteries rarely end that easily. The remains were carefully studied. Measurements were taken. Comparisons were made. Experts debated. Then the conclusion arrived. The bones almost certainly did not belong to Percy Fawcett. The breakthrough everyone had hoped for vanished overnight. Once again, the mystery survived. And strangely, that failure made the story even bigger. Because if those weren't Percy's remains, where was he? Where was Jack? Where was Raleigh? Years continued to pass. Then decades, but something unexpected happened. Instead of fading from memory, the disappearance grew. Each generation seemed to rediscover it. Writers published books. Researchers launched investigations. Explorers returned to the Amazon searching for clues. And almost every new inquiry uncovered another strange detail. One of the most persistent rumors involved reports from indigenous communities. Different investigators, arriving years apart, heard similar stories. Stories about foreign explorers, stories about men traveling through remote territories, stories that sounded promising at first, but every time researchers tried to verify them, certainty slipped away. The accounts changed. Locations shifted. Timelines conflicted. The closer people thought they were getting to the truth, the farther away it seemed. Yet hidden beneath all the rumors was a more important development, one that had nothing to do with finding Percy, and everything to do with understanding why he went into the jungle in the first place. For decades, scholars had dismissed the idea that large, sophisticated societies once existed deep within the Amazon. That belief had shaped how people viewed Fawcett. If the civilizations he imagined couldn't exist, then his search must have been misguided. Simple, logical, case closed, except history wasn't finished speaking. Throughout the 20th century, researchers kept uncovering anomalies. Some found unusual earthworks. Others identified ancient settlements. A few discovered evidence of large-scale landscape engineering. Individually, each discovery seemed small. Together, they began telling a different story. The Amazon wasn't simply a wilderness untouched by human history. It had been shaped by people for centuries, possibly much longer. And every new discovery raised an uncomfortable question. Had Percy Fawcett recognized something that mainstream scholarship had overlooked? Imagine how frustrating that realization must have been for some of his critics. The explorer they dismissed as a dreamer was beginning to look surprisingly perceptive. Not necessarily because he had found a lost city, but because he had challenged assumptions that later evidence was starting to weaken. That shift changed the mystery. It wasn't just about a disappearance anymore. It became a story about belief, about persistence, about a man who spent years defending an idea that many experts considered impossible. And then came another fascinating twist. As archaeological methods improved, researchers began uncovering evidence on a scale few people expected. Ancient roads, networks connecting settlements, large populations, complex societies. The picture of the Amazon was changing dramatically. The world Percy imagined wasn't looking quite so impossible anymore. Of course, none of this explained what happened in 1925. It didn't reveal where the three explorers went. It didn't tell us whether they came close to their destination. And it certainly didn't explain why nobody ever found definitive evidence. But it did something else. It transformed the way people viewed Percy Fawcett. Instead of asking only, "How did he disappear?" people began asking another question. What if he was right? And that question would prove just as powerful as the mystery itself. Because the more researchers learned about the ancient Amazon, the more they realized that Percy may have been searching for something rooted in reality. Not fantasy, not myth, something history had simply failed to understand yet. And if that was true, then the final expedition of 1925 becomes even more haunting, because it raises a possibility that refuses to disappear. What if Percy Fawcett spent his entire life chasing a truth, and came closer to it than anyone ever realized? By the time the 21st century arrived, the mystery of Percy Fawcett had entered a strange new phase. The search for the man was slowly becoming a search for the world he believed once existed. And with every passing year, the evidence grew harder to ignore. Researchers using satellite technology began seeing patterns hidden beneath the rainforest canopy, shapes that nature rarely creates on its own. Straight lines, geometric earthworks, ancient pathways, entire networks that had remained invisible from the ground. In some places, the forest was concealing traces of communities that had disappeared centuries ago. What shocked many archaeologists wasn't simply that these settlements existed. It was their scale. For generations, The common assumption had been that the Amazon could only support relatively small populations. Now evidence suggested something far more complex: large communities, regional networks, sophisticated land management, carefully planned settlements. The deeper researchers looked, the more they realized the story of the Amazon had been incomplete. And suddenly, Percy Fawcett no longer looked like an eccentric explorer chasing fantasies. He looked like a man who had noticed clues long before others were willing to take them seriously. Of course, being partly vindicated by history offers little comfort when you've been missing for a century. The central mystery remained untouched. Where did Percy, Jack, and Raleigh go? What happened after Dead Horse Camp? Why did no confirmed trace of them ever emerge? Historians proposed theories. Some believed the expedition encountered hostile conditions or conflict with local groups. Others suggested disease, injury, or simple misfortune. A few theories were more imaginative, but despite countless books, articles, and investigations, none could be proven beyond doubt. And perhaps that's what makes this story so enduring. Most mysteries eventually shrink. New evidence appears, questions are answered, the unknown becomes known. The Fawcett mystery never quite followed that path. Instead, it expanded. Every decade added new layers. The disappearance inspired explorers, writers, researchers, filmmakers. Even people who had never set foot in South America found themselves fascinated by a man who vanished into a sea of green. Yet beneath all the theories and speculation lies something much more personal. A father, a son, and a friend. It's easy to get lost in maps and mysteries, to focus on lost cities and unsolved disappearances. But every great historical mystery begins with human beings, people who laughed, made plans, worried about the future, expected to come home. Jack Fawcett was only 21, young enough to believe that the greatest adventures still lay ahead of him. Raleigh Rymel was even younger, the kind of age where entire lifetimes remain unwritten. And Percy, despite decades of experience, still carried the optimism of a man who believed one more expedition might finally answer the question that had followed him for years. That human side often gets buried beneath the legend, but it's the reason the story survives, because almost everyone understands unfinished journeys. Almost everyone knows what it feels like to search for answers, to wonder, to hope, to revisit old questions long after logic says you should move on. For Nina Fawcett, that reality lasted far longer than most people realize. While the world debated theories, she spent years defending her husband's reputation, years resisting the idea that he had been reckless or foolish, years believing that history would eventually recognize that there was more to his story than a disappearance. In some ways, history proved her right, not because the mystery was solved, but because the ideas Percy championed received a second look. The Amazon was more sophisticated than many people once believed. Its past was richer, its civilizations more complex, its history far deeper. That doesn't mean Percy found City Z, but it does mean that he was asking questions worth asking. And perhaps that is part of what keeps drawing people back to this story. Not merely the mystery of how it ended, but the possibility that the missing explorer was standing on the edge of an important discovery. A discovery he never had the chance to fully reveal. And that brings us to the final chapter. Because after more than a century of searching, debating, theorizing, and hoping, we're left with one final question. What is Percy Fawcett's true legacy? Is it the mystery he left behind? Or is it something far greater? More than 100 years have passed since Percy Fawcett disappeared into the Amazon. Entire generations have lived and died without learning what happened beyond Dead Horse Camp. The rainforest remains. The rivers still flow. The jungle continues growing over old trails, abandoned camps, and forgotten stories. Yet somehow, Percy Fawcett never completely vanished. Most explorers are remembered for discoveries they made. Percy is remembered for a question he left behind. And that may be why his story still feels alive. Think about it. He never returned with proof of a lost city. He never published the final chapter of his expedition. He never stood before the world and said, "I found it." Instead, he disappeared. And in doing so, he created one of the most enduring mysteries in modern history. But perhaps the mystery isn't the most important part of his legacy. Perhaps it's what the mystery revealed. For decades, people laughed at the idea that advanced societies once flourished deep within the Amazon. Many scholars dismissed the possibility entirely. Yet modern archaeology has forced historians to rethink that assumption. Ancient settlements, road networks, engineered landscapes, evidence of large populations. Discovery after discovery has revealed a past that earlier generations never fully understood. No, archaeologists have not uncovered a city called Z exactly as Percy imagined it. But they have uncovered something remarkable. Proof that the Amazon's history was far richer than many experts once believed. And that changes the story. Because now, when people look back at Percy Fawcett, they don't simply see a missing explorer. They see a man who challenged accepted ideas. A man who looked at the evidence available to him and refused to ignore it. A man willing to risk comfort, reputation, and eventually his life pursuing a question he believed mattered. History is filled with people who were wrong. It's also filled with people who were right for reasons nobody understood at the time. Percy occupies a fascinating space somewhere between those two possibilities. And maybe that's why the mystery remains so powerful. Because the disappearance is only half the story. The other half is human. A father and son setting out together. A wife waiting for letters that never arrived. A family living with uncertainty instead of answers. A dream pursued all the way to the edge of the known world. When we talk about Percy Fawcett today, it's tempting to focus only on the missing expedition. The unanswered questions. The theories. The rumors. But the deeper lesson may be something else entirely. Human progress often begins with curiosity. With someone willing to ask questions others dismiss. With someone willing to follow a trail that appears impossible. Sometimes those journeys end in triumph. Sometimes they end in mystery. But they still change the world. Percy Fawcett never solved the puzzle that consumed his life. At least not in a way history can verify. Yet the questions he asked helped inspire generations of explorers, archaeologists, and researchers to look at the Amazon differently. And in that sense, his influence survived long after he was gone. So what happened in 1925? Did Percy, Jack, and Raleigh come close to discovering something extraordinary? Did they simply fall victim to the dangers that had claimed so many others before them? Did the jungle keep its secret? The honest answer is the same one historians have been forced to give for more than a century. We don't know. And perhaps we never will. But somewhere beyond the last confirmed letter, beyond the final known campsite, beyond the maps and theories and endless debates, 3 men continued walking into the forest. The world watched them disappear, and then spent the next 100 years trying to understand why. If you've enjoyed this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries,